welcome. The first anniversary of Sandy, the storm of the century, is coming up. Here we are in October. Are we prepared personally and architecturally to better absorb the next punch and to bounce back sooner? Yes, it's a quiet hurricane season so far, but it ain't over till it's over, right? So we'll talk to planners and the Red Cross about readiness and resilience. And in our public intellectual segment today, where we hear about research that can change our minds and public policy, we'll ask, has peer pressure overshot science in telling pregnant women what they can't do for 9 months of their lives, like drink? Then, redesigning city government in the age of big data. Washington may seem opaque, also dysfunctional this week in particular, but in some cities, government is getting way more transparent and responsive digitally. Boston is a model worth looking at, as it turns out. First, though, designing for disaster. How do we become not just a sustainable city, but a resilient one in the face of the next Sandy or other disaster? Monday, there was a big conference about just this question here in Manhattan. Joining us, Russell Unger. His organization, Urban Green Council, convened that gathering. He's on the mayor's Building Resiliency Task Force. And with us as well, a key conference panelist, Claire Weisz of WXY Architecture. She co-founded the Design Trust for Public Space, and we'll see some of her shop's water-conscious designs. Welcome to both of you. So nice of you to come in. Russell, how prepared are we for the next Sandy?
Well, we're certainly better prepared. I mean, we haven't seen seawalls go up in the last year or anything like that. What I think we've developed an enormous amount of is the soft infrastructure that helps make us more resilient. I mean, building owners have a sense of what to expect in a hurricane. The average New Yorker out there is going to take warnings very seriously and listen to what the government has to say. And I think agencies are ready in a way they never were. I think we've crossed a psychological barrier that's really important.
So what's that term, soft infrastructure? People are going, what? Isn't infrastructure hard?
I just made that up. But what I'm talking about is kind of the knowledge base, the kind of sense in the population. And so much of what we do is a combination of the tools at our disposal and how we manage those tools, the knowledge we have. And our knowledge and our ability to manage the tools we already have has definitely increased.
And at the level of the law, City Council just passed some kind of 5-point recommendations bill, is that right?
Yeah, we led the Building Resiliency Task Force for the council and the mayor's office, and in that task force the report of the task force were recommendations for 25 legislative changes. They just passed 5 in one sweep, and they have bills that would take up another 14 of those before the end of the year.
So Claire, are we talking about better buildings, or are we gradually redesigning the whole city for a globally warm future? What's the job as you see it?
Well, I think architects certainly hope it is paradigm shift. I think that before Sandy, if you basically tried to explain to anyone what a base flood elevation is, or they would look at you and wonder why it mattered. And when you tell someone where their base flood elevation is now, whether it's a building owner or whether it's someone on a community board, they understand that what that is, and they know if their building is below a base flood elevation, they might start thinking about floodgates, they might look at their windows, they might look at flood vents, but in a way they kind of understand better what the building code new codes were already saying in the first place. There's nothing to replace experience. Even among colleagues, we were all marveling how maps we drew, showing what parts were below base flood, below certain elevations were above.
The flood zones, basically.
The flood zones.
Right? Different
all of a
levels
sudden, the
flood
map,
zone.
it comes alive. Like you understand the meaning in that map a different way.
Once there's actually water in your basement and in your
Well,
third floor and fourth floor.
Well, once it exceeds actually all predictions.
The word resiliency, is that different from the bouncing back? Or is that the bouncing back? But we were talking about preparedness. Resiliency is different from being prepared for the next storm, right? That's what happens once you get socked again.
Well, it's funny, this came up in our conversations yesterday, and I think the consensus I agree with is that resiliency is about being able to bounce back quickly. I mean, I think that we will be able to stand direct effects to as best we can, but ultimately we're never going to be able to have a system where we're never going to get water in, where a hurricane level wind won't cause some damage. What makes us resilient is our ability to limit that damage and recover as quickly as possible.
So from the point of view of someone who's on a mayor's task force and worked for city council, can you legislate for resiliency?
In some ways you can. I think you can legislate to ensure that some very, very minimal standards are always met. So for example, I think one of the most important recommendations from the task force was that multifamily buildings have water available on a low floor in a common area. And we have this amazing water system in New York that doesn't need power, it's gravity fed, and as long as you're on a lower floor, you have water. And the issue is, do you have a tap you can get water from? So next time we have a big storm, we're going to have this, in a couple of years, we're going to have this available.
I'm reading, Claire, that at the Resiliency Conference on Monday, Jana Lieber, president of the World Trade Center Properties group, said that putting in new building regulation is easy, the low-hanging fruit. Getting government and Con Ed to ready the city for the next Sandy is the hard part. Would you agree with that?
I really agree with that. I think that we don't see our streets, our sidewalks, our esplanades, our bike paths as part of probably the most important key to the city's resiliency strategy. I think the SIR report, and Seth Pinsky talked to that too, actually puts that out there, that that public realm is, in terms of a layered system, kind of a key component. It's something that we can do right away. You don't have to wait a long time to raise an esplanade or create a soft edge or put riprap in.
All right, so speaking of esplanades, you've got some images that you're going to walk us through here. Let's put up the first one. It's up, so Claire, what are we looking at?
I think actually we're looking at, it sounds like a place many New Yorkers may live nearby but not know. This is Sherman Creek, and it's the lower part of the Inwood neighborhood. It's right on the Harlem River. And this is...
so that's the Harlem River. That's the Bronx River on the right.
Yeah, and at the very top is the University Heights Bridge. Broadway
right
goes up.
in the middle, going across the river there.
And really, you're right across from Yankee Stadium, basically.
Uh-huh.
And here this is in 2011. We got commissioned by this city to look at how you get public access. And at the time, really, the question, we understood that this is in a Zone A, and it's very low. And there's critical facilities here. Con Ed has a lot of this property. It's a critical transformer station. Bridges has property here. There's some big distributors. There are people living in this neighborhood too who wanted access to the water. And so the kind of proposal put out there, improving the edge, could improve a lot of things.
And how do you improve the edge? I guess it's that area delineated in white with the dotted white lines coming out.
And shockingly, you look at a project like this that was planned rationally for 2018 to 2022, and we're really now talking about, with sea level rise, this not being able to wait that long, I think, for projects like this. A project like this could really be elevated. It has wetlands, it's restoring a cove, it puts marine habitat back into the edge, and it gets public access so people really know where the water is, but it also protects the edge. So if we wait till 2020, I think that there's a possibility for these projects to be important.
And this river walk, is this basically the same place on the Bronx side?
And there's this, on the Bronx side is a big park and Yankee Stadium. So this is right basically, there's a public school there. You know where Dyckman Houses is? It's right beside Dyckman Houses. It's right beside Swindler Cove that was brought back to life.
That's the very top of the Harlem River
exactly.
Drive.
And below it is a very large MTA yards, train yards. So you're really looking at big infrastructure here, and at the same time a neighborhood that wants access to the water. There's street end parks in place, and this would protect it further.
Russell, what are you thinking? Or did this come up in any of your task force sessions?
Well, funny, in a way, our effort was trying to make sure we don't just think about this, because certainly we have to think about sea level rise and flooding, and I totally agree with what Claire said in terms of doing things now that have multiple benefits. So we put in the livable streets, and we reduce stormwater impacts, and that's also really helpful with big floods. But what happens when there's a power failure? I mean, this is one of the things we worry the most about, the secondary effects from a hurricane or an ice storm, or flooding, and how ready are we for that? And that's something where we've seen massive changes in our buildings in the last 100 years. We have buildings that we only can occupy because of an elevator. We can only get water on the upper floors because of a pump. We only can stay warm in because of power, of heating that requires some electrical power. 100 years ago, you had a wood stove or a coal stove. The idea of there being no trees suddenly wasn't going to be an option. But now we have this unlikely but real possibility. We can be in scenarios where we need cooling or we need heating, and the central power supply is out. And those are some of the things we really worry about.
So let's take a look at another image. And now we're in a very different place than we were before, right, Claire?
So this is Pier 40, and this is a community plan called the Pier 40 Champions, who are concerned about, and as is everyone else, the Friends of Hudson River Park, about the pier, all of our piers, our marine structures, which are essentially buildings on the water, falling into the water. Actually, the water being cleaner has really, in fact, had a negative effect on the structures in the water, and that's because of the marine borer. And so we're looking at just a huge investment in protecting all these piles up and down all these rivers. And so
Pier 40, that's around Houston Street at the
yes,
Hudson
and that's
River.
where many people send their kids to play soccer.
Right.
Constantly.
That great turf field
yes.
down there.
And that was all parked cars only, I think, less than 10 years ago. Got converted by the community into soccer fields. It's incredibly popular.
And baseball.
And baseball.
Son played baseball
One of the few
there.
places you can play baseball. And these kinds of spaces, big recreation spaces, are lacking. But that structure itself has a lot of potential, whether it's for offices or more cars or more fields. But
and how about that High Line that's there as part of this?
This idea here was to repurpose, to remove parts of the building that are falling apart and to repurpose parts of the building, in this case, a canopy where people used to drive around, to jog around. So I think it's there's a large adaptive reuse project out there where we know certain structures are going to get wet, and you see in there this idea of allowing below the fields to actually take in water and release water. So there's some amount of heavy rains. These fields should be able to store water and not. So there's all sorts of discussions about how big structures like this can be wet flood-proofed, basically.
And is this a cross-section of the same thing, or
And
this is
this is
floating
another
somehow?
idea. The city sponsored, because of these structures, the city sponsored, focusing on the seaport in Pier 40, a competition called, I think, Changing Course. And it out to biologists, engineers, architects. And we put in an entry with some engineers about replacing fixed parts of structures with floating structures so that they would better be able to adapt to new conditions, be more affordable. But there were some other great ideas in that competition, including a concrete coating system, which I actually think is in the next slide, that attracts oysters and mussels and marine life and actually makes the concrete stronger. So you can kind of see that in the corner, and I think that's the dream of, as we remake some of our edges, that they actually build a better habitat.
Now, the city was involved in this competition through the Economic Development Corporation. Are you familiar with this?
Not the competition.
But actually, as a mechanism, there's been a lot more of these competitions for new ideas out there. And one of them currently by HUD is called Rebuild by Design.
We're part of that.
Yeah.
You know, next time, Russell, it's not going to be Sandy. It's going to be something else. Just as in a way we were prepared for Irene after Irene, which was more of a wind event, and we got Sandy, which was more of a storm surge event. So is there a way to prepare for a range of possibilities, or is Mother Nature just too unpredictable?
Well, again, I think, as we talked about earlier, I think that our best ability is to kind of minimize the impacts and then be able to bounce back as quickly as possible. But I think that we have to be, it's very difficult when you bring a group of people together after a major disaster and getting them to think about the things other than that disaster that was just so fresh on everyone's mind. So that's kind of a pull of the boat that we constantly had to struggle against. I think we managed to. I think you see that in our work and the SIR report. But yeah, the next event, we didn't have hurricane level winds. We could have that and major damage to facades. We could have a blackout in the depth of winter. What are you going to do in an apartment building in the depth of winter with no heating? Our studies show that you'd have, again, if we had a power failure the coldest week of 2013, we'd be in the 40s inside the typical New York City building. That's not habitable
Do you
temperature.
have an answer for that?
Well, it's going to be over time. We're going to, as we upgrade our stock, as we replace windows, as we replace walls, we upgrade them over time. So that's not going to be, there's not going to be a quick answer there.
Well, thank you both for coming
Thank you.
in today. Now, the CEO of the Red Cross of Greater New York says most of us fear the next Sandy, but nonetheless are unprepared for it. We'll talk to him next. So when the next hurricane or other disaster hits, the Red Cross wants us to have a family evacuation plan, emergency supplies, and more. But a survey it just released says most of us are worried but not making these preparations. Josh Lockwood is CEO of the Red Cross of Greater New York and joins us now. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Brian.
So tell us about this gap between worry and preparation.
Yeah, Brian, we see this every day at the Red Cross. It's the psychology of disaster is that none of us thinks that we're vulnerable to a terrible thing happening, whether it's a large storm or a single-family home fire. And so people don't take basic steps to be prepared. And so part of our effort is to have our volunteers out in communities every day preaching preparedness, but it definitely is a challenge.
Your survey found many other things, for example, how people get their emergency news, mostly from local TV.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that?
Well, it's really important that, at the Red Cross, we say get a kit, make a plan, stay informed. And that staying informed piece is really important because it tracks how people are getting their information. And as part of a preparedness kit in your home, you should always be able to have access to local news, whether it's through a crank radio or a generator for a television, to keep yourself informed so you know what's happening in the outside world.
That crank radio, not everybody knows about it at WNYC, where I also work, the radio station.
Yeah.
We give them away.
Yeah.
To members as something that they can ask for, and you don't even need batteries, and you can just crank with your hand, and
right.
You'll get radio reception. And people don't even think, yeah, the TV is great, and the TV stations, like the radio stations, are generally going to have generators, so they're still broadcasting. But to whom, via what, if you don't have power for your TV or computer?
That's right, and it's so important. I mean, take Superstorm Sandy as an example. There were evacuation orders going out. There were updates about where relief supplies were, where it was safe to go to get those relief supplies and to get more information. So staying informed through those periods is not only important to have access to that information, but also to give you peace of mind that the world is progressing and things are moving forward.
And there are smartphone apps that you can get too, right?
Yeah, and in fact, at the Red Cross, one of the most popular things that we've done over the past year is launch a series of disaster apps. There's a hurricane app, a tornado app, a wildfire app. They're free at redcross.org, and people can download them, and we've had over 1 million downloads over the past year. And it's amazing, Brian. We see that these apps save lives. Families will write back to us and say, I heard the tornado alarm, I'm on my smartphone, I have my family in the basement, and we know where to go for help.
So that's one of the apps. What's another one?
There's a hurricane app. So the hurricane app can help folks in that moment know where shelters are, where you should go, and if you happen to be trapped in your home, how you can be prepared in that moment. There's also a first aid app, and we get a lot of great feedback about folks at a moment's notice can help a loved one who's come upon a terrible situation.
So relative to city services and FEMA and other things that are out there, how does the Red Cross see your role?
Yeah, the Red Cross is a convener of the not-for-profit sector to help all of us be prepared for emergencies. We work very closely with New York City's Office of Emergency Management and have a permanent seat there, so there's constant coordination there. We work with the city to preach preparedness throughout the city, and beyond the city, we take a major role in sheltering in the event of disaster. And the Red Cross has other lines of service as well, but in the disaster realm, we're involved in that full cycle of recovery. It's preparedness, response, and recovery.
There was some criticism of the Red Cross after Sandy that had to do with not reaching people quickly or fully enough, and also not spending the, I think, $300 million or so that you took in as quickly as some people would have liked to see on actual help. Can you respond to either of those criticisms?
Of course. You know, to the first point, I think in any large disaster, any big institution like ours is going to be criticized. In the case of Sandy, our primary challenge was just the scope of this disaster. This was a storm that was 900 square miles. It hit across 12 states, Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. And we were certainly stretched here in our region. We were asked to open twice as many shelters, for example, as we had capacity to do. We did it, but we couldn't be all places at all times. And that's hard for us, but we definitely take lessons learned from this experience and applied them. As in regard to the Sandy funds, those are applied across those 12 states, that $300 million that the American public generously gave us. To this point, we've spent about 90% or spent or committed about 90% of those funds. And the remaining funds, we're cutting checks every day to go to individuals who are making their recovery plans, waiting to hear from insurance companies and looking at flood maps. And that just takes time.
So you must have learned a lot from Sandy. You've just said as much. What are some of the things? What are some of the main lessons that the Red Cross has learned for its own disaster relief the next time?
Yeah, and I think some of the lessons learned we have at the Red Cross, Brian, are applicable not just to the Red Cross, but really across disaster relief across the country. This was one of the first major disasters to hit a large urban area on this scale. One thing we learned is that there is a need for the Red Cross and other organizations to accommodate what we call spontaneous volunteers. We have thousands of people who show up on our doorstep who want to help in some way, and there's a real need to quickly train them and deploy them in a way that's useful to the relief operation and doesn't slow things down. And what I saw across the not-for-profit sector and even with the city is big-hearted folks who wanted to help, but it was really hard to deploy them in a reasonable way. One success we did have in that realm is we were able to take folks who showed up on our doorstep, quickly train them to be shelter workers, and then have them sign up for a 12-hour, 24 or 72-hour shift and go work in a shelter because power was out for so long that these shelters were staying open for a long time. That said, there were thousands of other folks who came to us that we were not able to accommodate. So through technology and other means, we are now setting ourselves up to do that better. I think another thing that we learned is that in this disaster, more than any other we've seen, social media drove a lot of the response. And being able to take in that information and then ground that information and respond is incredibly important. You know, we would hear from a family that would say, I'm on the 18th floor of a high-rise in the Rockaways, and my son's on a respirator, the elevator isn't working, we need food, can you help us, Red Cross? And we'd be able to help that family in that moment once we grounded that information was accurate. But I think for all of the disaster response sort of infrastructure, governmental and non-governmental, we have to figure out ways to use social media in a way that's really useful and powerful, and I think that's beginning to happen now.
Do you think along those lines that you learned anything from the Occupy movement and their very decentralized way of being out there, which might be the opposite of what you're compelled to do?
Yeah, I think what the Occupy movement did was very different from what typically the Red Cross does. We go into communities and provide massive amounts of supplies and meals to folks who need them. But what Occupy did so well is they were resident in those communities and deployed those spontaneous volunteers very effectively to do that work. And they ended up being incredible partners of the Red Cross. I mean, I don't have enough praise for them. And certainly for myself, and I was relatively new to the Red Cross when Sandy hit, I want to steal ideas from anyone who has a good idea, and that they had some great ideas that we are now looking to operationalize. You
came from Habitat for Humanity, right?
Yeah.
Were you able to bring ideas from that to the Red Cross, either relevant to Sandy or just generally?
Absolutely. I can't say how important that's been. One, because both are volunteer-driven organizations. 95% of the Red Cross workforce are volunteers. We had 17,000 volunteers from 50 states come to New York, sleeping on the floors of our office for 6 months. And so having that volunteer experience was very important. But from a housing perspective, so much of this disaster is related to housing. And so, one thing that when we were responding, there was an immediate need to muck out homes, for example, that had been destroyed or damaged by Sandy. And I think there were some people around me that says, well, the Red Cross doesn't do that. But I worked with our partners at New York Cares, another nonprofit organization that was mucking out homes, and said, you know, we have thousands of people coming to our doorstep. They want to help. Can we send them to you to do this work? And so we were able to do that. And if you can believe it, Brian, here we are almost 12 months later. We still have volunteers going out every week with New York Cares and the Red Cross volunteers mucking out homes.
And I think people don't realize how much the Red Cross is out there doing things, excuse me, in much smaller disaster relief contexts every day. We hear about it when something like Sandy hits, but don't you respond to house fires and all kinds of other things on a very hyper-local level?
Yeah, and it's really incredible. This is the busiest area of the country for the American Red Cross, and the Red Cross responds to 70,000 disasters every year in the United States, and about 3,000 here in the New York City area. And what we do is after the fire...
3,000, that's like almost 10 a day.
Yeah, 6 to 10 a day is our typical run rate. Right now, I know we're in Yonkers, Brooklyn, and the Bronx responding to fires that are happening in multifamily contexts. And so the fire department leaves, a family has lost everything. Sometimes they've lost a loved one or a pet. And it's the Red Cross that's there to work with folks to give them financial assistance, temporary housing, and get them back on their feet.
It's good that you're out there.
Thank you.
Hopefully we won't need you anytime soon.
We hope so too.
And thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Brian.
Recently, a Saudi Arabian cleric warned women never to drive. It would damage their ovaries, he said. Now, it's easy to dismiss that as ideology over science, but what about those warnings to women we hear in this country, like no wine when pregnant? That we considered next. Now, pregnancy advice from a doctor, but not the kind of doctor you expect. Pregnancy do's and don'ts get an economist's treatment in today's Public Intellectual, our series looking at research that can change our minds and public policy. Emily Oster, PhD, is author of Expecting Better, Why the Conventional Pregnancy Wisdom is Wrong and What You Need to Know About It. She's an economics professor at the University of Chicago and a mom, and joins us via Skype from Chicago. Hello again, Emily. Welcome to our program. Hello from New York.
Hi, Brian. Nice to be here.
So tell us basically what you did first. For people who haven't seen your book yet or heard about it, you did a massive literature review of all the studies on pregnancy risks?
I did. So I got pregnant, and I think like a lot of women, I found myself encountering a lot of rules and a lot of restrictions and a lot of decisions. And for me, the place that I would start in my job is to look at the statistics and the data behind all of this stuff. And so I did, as you say, a massive literature review of the literature in public health, in medicine, some of it a little bit in economics, looking at all of these questions. And ultimately, the book is kind of the output of that review.
And it's got everything from wine to epidurals. But was there something, I'm curious, that you really wanted to know because you really didn't want to give it up? Something that triggered this for you personally, since you say it arose from your pregnancy?
Yeah, so I mean, there are, of course, I think for me, the biggest thing was coffee in terms of the things to give up. That was the thing where I really shudder at the thought of not having any. And some of the books will tell you don't have any, and some will tell you have a little bit, and some will say any amount is fine. And I was reassured to find there that definitely having a little bit is okay. And I actually came to think having, more like three cups a day was probably also fine.
What's the danger supposed to be with coffee? What's the science there? And how many studies have been done that actually measured it that you were able to look at?
So the concern with coffee, particularly in the first trimester, is miscarriage. So the idea is that if that it can that caffeine does cross the placenta, and in animal studies, you do see very high doses of caffeine do cause fetal losses. There are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers about caffeine and miscarriage. And I tried to do this sort of throughout the book to find the papers that were really good. And so in this case, that meant papers which had a good recording of how much caffeine people had, papers which compared women who were otherwise as similar as possible, other than their caffeine consumption. And so I do summarize a bunch of those in the book. And what I found is that, for the most part, even up to 3 or 4 cups a day, those seem to suggest that there isn't really an increased risk of miscarriage.
So let's take another thing people can drink, wine. What was the recommendation or the standard medical advice that you were inspecting there, and what did you find?
So the standard medical advice there is abstinence, and I think it's very clear. And I also talk about this in the book that having a lot to drink, even once or twice, actually can be very dangerous. But when I went to look at the question of occasional drinking, I asked the question I think a lot of women have, which is it okay to have a glass of wine once a week, twice a week? Something which a lot of OBs will say is fine. And there, you wanted to look for studies that compared women who drank no more than one drink at a time, no more than a few times a week, to women who abstained. And when you find studies like that, and they're actually mostly in Europe, you see that the children of women who drink in moderation don't perform any worse on intelligence tests, don't have any more behavior problems than the children of women who abstain. So I actually argue in the book that, in moderation, again, an occasional glass of wine is okay.
The Surgeon General disagrees with you on that point officially. Doesn't that office?
Yes, they do.
So how do you account for the difference? Are they just being overcautious as a matter of public policy? Are they reading the studies wrong? Where do you think that comes from if it's unnecessary?
I think that the biggest place that comes from is a place of caution. And I'm not even sure I would say overcaution. So I think there is often a distinction between, kind of what we say in our kind of official, like, here is a safe thing to do. And then when you look at the data, it's a little bit more nuanced. And I think that is a case, that this is a case like that. I think there is some also overinterpretation of flawed studies. So certainly you see studies. I found one where, yes, it claims that moderate drinking is problematic. One drink a day is a problem. But when you look at it, what you see is the children of women who drink one drink a day, their mothers also are more likely to use cocaine. They're also more likely to live in single parent households, things which we know have their own impacts on kids.
So you really have to isolate out the alcohol as the variable there.
Yeah, you do. And I think it's often hard to do in the US where we have because we have these really stringent rules, the only women who admit to having the occasional glass of wine are women who are sort of poorly selected in other ways.
How do you think the media does in general with pregnancy advice? Do they scare people because that makes sensational copy? Do they too easily accept the simple recommendations because the media is not filled with scientists and researchers ourselves? How do you see the media's role?
I mean, I think that they're I've now interacted a lot with the media around the book. I think there is a sense of sort of looking for a headline. And, it's hard in a short period of time to sort of get all the nuance that comes around these scientific studies. And I think it's actually very hard to understand which things are causality and which things are correlation. And is this study more causal than this other study? So in something like alcohol or caffeine, there are basically no randomized trials at all. So we can't say, okay, here's the randomized trial we can be really confident about. Instead, you're sorting through a bunch of studies, all of which are not perfect, and trying to say, okay, this is the best of these studies.
Let me jump in on that question
of trained in, but that's not what most people are trained in.
Let me jump in on that question of correlation versus causation. If you find, for example, that some kind of health risk to the fetus or to the woman is correlated with a particular behavior, it just so happens that women who do this wind up having this problem disproportionately, but you can't prove that the behavior caused the problem. Is that really the standard you want to look for before ceasing the behavior? Or if you see that it's correlated, associated, why not act at that point with an abundance of caution and advise women to do so until science can prove that it's safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear that point a lot. I think that's a reasonable point. But you have to remember, nothing that we're doing has been proven safe by that dimension. So we have no, randomized controlled studies that show that, having too many oranges is bad for you. Now we have no real reason to think. It's a little different because we have no reason to think in excess those would be a problem. But there are some things where we think in excess, like Tylenol, where we think in excess they would be a problem. But we have a lot of correlational studies which show that women who have Tylenol don't have any more birth defects than women who don't. And so I think, then we kind of put that all together and we say, okay, from this, we conclude that there is good evidence of safety. And in some sense, what I'm doing in the book is not saying, okay, you should drink or you should have a lot of coffee, but rather saying, I think that most of the decisions that we're making should be subjected to the same kind of, risk-benefit trade-off that we're kind of typically making in our everyday lives. And here's the data for you to think about that for yourself.
There was one risk in your book that really surprised me in terms of how seriously you thought women should take it. This is going to surprise people, that it's about gardening of all things.
Yeah, so when I started looking into the issue of toxoplasmosis, which is an infection you can get from food, it's something people also associate with the cat's litter box. It turns out actually for most people, the cat litter box is not a problem, but it is possible to get this from gardening, and that's actually one of the more significantly associated risks. And so I did end up thinking, and I was surprised by this as well, that if you're going to be gardening while you're pregnant, you should wear a mask. It's crazy.
But I guess there you go. If you're looking at the science, you might have wanted to come up with everything's okay, don't worry, but some things you decided that, hey, that risk is real, it's there, and maybe people don't know about it as much as they should. Do you think that you brought something to this scientific literature review as an economist that an MD or a biology researcher may not have?
Yeah, I think I come at this in a very different way. And so I think that's part of what makes the book, I hope, a good complement with the time that women have with their doctors. Because I think for me, like the studies and the data is really the starting point, not the sort of clinical side. And so I think that really getting into this causality correlation, that's something where the training that I have is probably better than the training in medical school. And so I think putting that together with your doctor's clinical knowledge is a sort of, in some ways, a more complete picture of all of the stuff that you should know when you're pregnant to make these decisions well.
Emily Oster, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Government. Maybe it's opaque and dysfunctional in Washington, especially this week, but in many cities, services are becoming just a click away. We will talk next about the new participatory urbanism. In an age where customer satisfaction is expected to be a tweet away, how smart and efficient is your city government? Metropolises around the world are feeling the pressure and quickly partnering up with entrepreneurs and innovative minds to close the gap electronically between citizens and government. Think 311, City Hall, and much more, all stuffed into a supercomputer beaming to your iPhone. It's becoming a multi-billion-dollar business, too. But are cities making the right decisions to get us to what's been called participatory urbanism? We'll get some futurist thinking now from Anthony Townsend. He's the author of Smart Cities, Big Data, Civic Hackers, and the Quest for a New Utopia. And for the boots on the ground perspective, we're joined by policy consultant Chris Osgood in Boston. Chris has been working closely with Boston's Mayor, Thomas Menino, a civic leader with high hopes for the new urban mechanics, as they call it, at work in cities. Welcome to both of you. Thanks very much for coming on. So, Anthony, what does this term smart infrastructure actually mean?
So I think what's been happening for the last few years is that we've seen big technology companies very aggressively trying to take some of the technology solutions that they've built for multinational corporations to help run global enterprises and apply them to the problem of running cities at the local level. And so there's a whole array of technologies that can sense what's going on in the city, that can communicate that back to City Hall or to an agency, and then analyze that data to help public managers think about running the city better.
What's the best example of it you could think of in New York?
My favorite example in New York is a project called Midtown in Motion, which wired up about 500 traffic signals in Midtown Manhattan to allow them to be remotely controlled. And so that allows DOT to do things like green light an avenue to allow the president to get in or get out. It allows them to very fine tune the signaling to relieve traffic jams as they start to understand traffic patterns better.
And Chris, in Boston, another vocabulary term for everybody, what is the new urban mechanics?
Sure. The Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics is basically the research and development group that Mayor Menino has established here in his city to experiment with the way in which cities deliver services with and for their residents. So we partner with entrepreneurs both inside and outside of City Hall to try new approaches, whether it's how we teach kids or how we design our streets or how we engage in sort of democratic dialogue around policy and decision making.
And I see you have 30 projects up there. Are there any few that the city is most focusing on?
Sure. So one of our biggest sort of areas of work is really empowering our residents to be our eyes and ears in our neighborhoods. So we've done a lot of work to give new tools, particularly mobile apps, to our residents so they can report the real sort of basic neighborhood issues like potholes and graffiti straight to the right person in city government so they can go about and fix them quickly.
Does that work for crime prevention too?
So one of the things that we've seen is that these sorts of tools in general empower our residents to be more civically engaged, and I think a more engaged community in general leads to a healthier community.
Anthony, how big of an industry do you think this is? There's a lot of private companies developing apps and other things, right?
Right. So I think if you look just at the infrastructure side of it, which, I mean, we should be frank, this is a very different piece than what Chris is talking about. This idea that you can make cities more efficient is very different than the idea of making citizens more engaged. But that infrastructure piece alone is about $100 billion over the next 10 years globally. And it's just a tiny percent of the trillions of dollars we'll be spending on the sort of old-fashioned infrastructure, the pipes, the highways, the electric power lines. And so this idea that smart is just a tiny part of how much you spend to build a city, but it delivers this tremendous amount of value is why everyone's so excited about it.
So this is more what the technocrats, and I don't mean that as an insult, at City Hall might be looking at, rather than trying to get a participatory, engaged citizenry. This is what the experts are seeing.
Right, and I think that's what's really interesting about Boston's approach. When I interviewed Chris and his colleagues when I was writing my book, and it occurred to me as I listened to them talk about the mayor's vision and what they were doing, this was the first sort of smart city vision that sounded more like it was crafted by a political scientist than an engineer. A lot of these visions are being sort of spoon-fed to cities by companies like IBM and Cisco that are trying to sell them products.
Chris, do you want to react to that? Is there a place where smart infrastructure meets participatory urbanism?
So I think there's definitely a place for kind of the more traditional smart infrastructure, that which sort of drives efficiency and transparency. But I do think that it can't be the only piece. We need to both become more efficient and more transparent, but also become more engaging and more empowering. And that's something which our Mayor Menino, believes very strongly in Boston. He thinks it's really important that we figure out ways to not just think about the 20,000 employees of City Hall, but the 620,000 residents citywide and how they can all participate in creating a better city. So I think that the two pieces are complementary. It's not enough just to focus on pure efficiency and sort of big data systems, but also the real tools for engagement.
And also, Anthony, I would think that they really connect in terms of the outcomes, because if you have, 8 million eyes and ears on where potholes are in need of repair or anything else, then you're going to wind up with better data that the experts can work with at City Hall, no?
But they do support each other. And the example that I like to use to contrast, okay, so what if you wanted to design a system for lost and found for an entire city? If you ask an IBM engineer, they'd probably say, put a tag on everything and put scanners all over the city, and we'll build a big database, and you can search it just like you search Google. Find your keys. I had a student walk into my office about a year ago who basically wanted to build a social network app for lost and found. So you'd have a community of finders who would go out and find the objects and return them to people because it made them feel good. Same problem, completely different way of approaching how you would solve it. One that's very much about engagement, another one that's about efficiency and big data.
And Chris in Boston, I guess again that those things connect. An example that I've seen pertaining to your office's work is that departments didn't believe in the data necessarily, and now when it's coming in from all points in the city, the folks at the top actually think this data is more reliable, so it helps them act on it better?
I think it's certainly the case, but I think that Anthony's example is a terrific example, and to provide sort of a case that we're using here in Boston, we've piloted a mobile phone app called Street Bump, and what Street Bump is simply a mobile app you can run on an iPhone, and it literally uses the accelerometers on the phone to sort of sense how smooth or rough your ride is during your day, and sends that information to our public works department so we can get a sense of what the big issues are that people are hitting on their daily drives. Now, we could have taken a very different approach here and sort of just paid sort of big sensor trucks to drive around the city of Boston. But instead, we partnered with our residents and our own employees to collect this data. And we've actually found that manhole covers are a significant problem for the city, and we've actually been able to fix over 1,250 manhole covers that were the biggest problems that Boston residents were hitting on their daily drives.
Of course, in New York, Anthony, I think it would be all bumps all the time on the road, so I don't know if that same thing could work here.
Yeah, you know, if you've ridden a city bike recently, since the launch of the bike share project, I think you have an intimate understanding of the quality of New York City streets. It's a bumpy ride, for sure.
That's right. Well, some of the bike lanes are actually pretty good. So, Chris, how are you measuring success? This all sounds like a great idea. It sounds like you're taking steps at the practical level. How are you figuring out what's actually working?
So one of the things that we believe strongly in is that our projects, our experiments are actually sort of experiments and not just sort of pilots, things that we run and then don't analyze. So with all of our work, we look to couple our experiment with an outside researcher from one of our local universities who can dive in and really measure the impact. And when we think of impact, we really think of it along two dimensions. One around sort of the more operational outcomes. Is something like street bump actually leading to smoother roads in Boston? But we also look at the engagement impact. Is something like this investment helping our residents really feel like they've got a greater role in improving the city around them, and also have a greater understanding of how their actions are actually contributing to a healthier city?
Anthony, is there any danger of cities getting fleeced by corporate big tech or giving up too much control to companies that have the expertise but may or may not actually have the public interest at heart?
Sure. I mean, a lot of these services, smart city services that are being offered by big tech companies are basically based on cloud computing. So your city's data is going to be in a server farm that may be in your city if you can afford to build one, but if you can't, it might be in another city, could be in another country. And if you decide you want to change vendors or you want to get some of that data back, they're basically going to have you, up against the wall.
You live in New York. What do you think Bloomberg got right? Is there any way to put a gauge on it? And are you concerned about a post-Bloomberg era after he seemed so focused on advancing the city in these technological ways?
I think I give the Bloomberg administration kind of an A- on tech initiatives. They've done some remarkable things. I think the one area where they didn't move aggressively enough was in expanding access to broadband, wireless service in the parks. This is something I worked on 10 years ago in Bryant Park. They're just getting to it now. Cities around the world are building gigabit speed to the home internet networks. And those are our global competitors, and New York doesn't have a real strategy around that. So we're at risk of falling behind in some areas.
And what you were just describing, what does that allow?
It's sort of the next generation. 10 years ago, we switched from dial-up to wired access. That was about a 10 to 50 factor speed bump. Gigabit is about another 100 to 200 factor speed bump, and it's allows you to watch multiple video streams, to explore immersive 3D environments, to access big data sets, science and education. It's the information highway, for the next decade.
And so, as it pertains to government, do De Blasio or Joe Lhota get it, or do you want to go there?
I try to look globally. So I think both of them offer us an opportunity to start to think about filling in some of the gaps in the technology initiatives. And I think some of these more citizen-focused engagement efforts are what's needed right now.
Chris, has Boston looked at other cities, or for that matter, other countries, to model what you're trying to do now?
Sure. I think there's a range of folks out there who are really offering some great practices. We have a companion office in Philadelphia that Mayor Nutter started, the Philadelphia Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And we've actually borrowed some of the technology that they've used, and they've created around sort of texting platforms for engagement here in Boston. Quite impressed by the work that Mike Flowers and his team has done in New York City, as well as some of the innovation work coming out of the Department of Education, and the tremendous focus on sort of real human-centered design that you see in many cities across Europe is really quite impressive, and I think points to a direction which is less around sort of big data than really just sort of big engagement or a real deeper understanding of constituent behaviors and interests.
So Anthony, give us a vision of the future in New York, democratically and smart infrastructurally.
I think it's a city where people are able to think about their own problems and very rapidly acquire the technology that they need to solve them. So one of the most exciting projects in the last year or so has been a mesh wireless network that's being built in Red Hook. It's a partnership between the New America Foundation and the Red Hook Initiative. And it was one of the few ways that people were able to get internet access in that neighborhood after Superstorm Sandy last year. And I actually live in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is another city that was flooded. And we're basically duplicating that effort to create a community-owned solar-powered internet that will stay up forever, no matter what happens.
And how does that work exactly?
It's basically like a bucket brigade. So it's a series of Wi-Fi hotspots that can send messages down the line until they get to one that has a wired internet connection, and you can connect back in.
Without electricity?
Well, we're going to use solar panels to power it. And if the internet connection goes down, we'll have a satellite uplink that we can throw out to give us basic connectivity.
Cool. Yeah. By the way, Chris, in Boston, I'm a Yankee fan, but I've been enjoying watching the Red Sox beards grow this summer.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to add about 4 or 5 inches to yours if you want to fit in. So there you go. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's our program for this week. Join us at the same time next week. And tune into my daily radio program, weekdays 10 a.m. to noon on WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, the likely incoming Brooklyn DA, Ken Thompson. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.